Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you this week?
As per usual, Gary, I am absolutely splendid. How are you?
Very good.
You're off the back of finishing your first placement, is it?
I am all done. On to GP next. Looking forward to it.
And what does that involve? GP versus you were in pediatrics, was it? I can't even remember what you were doing.
I was general medicine, general internal medicine. So adult inpatient medicine involving people who have presented and been admitted to the hospital for many different reasons. And now this is general practice. So it's outpatient, people who go to their GP for whatever reason. And you have a whole host of presentations naturally. So a little bit different, but looking forward to it nonetheless.
And have you been enjoying being in the hospital? Because I know I'm asking these questions because I know people are interested. They're like, what's the story with Gary? How's he getting on?
Yes, I much prefer the hospital environment because I like, well, it actually sounds awful, but I'm more interested in the very sick patients rather than the people who are, kind of well. So I like, the more intense disease states, let's say. So being in the hospital is concordant with that, whereas in general practice, there's maybe a little bit more. You could have a head cold, or you could have someone coming in for a sick cert, or someone's back is sore, their knee is sore, and then of course you get the odd serious complaint. Or so it's a very important job for sure, but for me, I prefer inpatient medicine.
Fantastic. Anyway, somewhat related, but obviously not related. What are we talking about today?
So here we're talking about longevity. We're talking about the role that exercise plays in longevity, or the prolonging of one's life, and along with that, improving one's quality of life. And specifically what we're focusing on today is the role of aerobic fitness versus strength, which we might broaden to cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory fitness versus strength and its related adaptations like hypertrophy, muscle mass, etc. So basically, should you lift or should you run? That's the fundamental question. And as you can probably guess, of course, we're going to say do both, but we want to make it a little bit more of an elaborate discussion than just that.
Yeah. And this is really important to kind of dive into because, first of all, you see people asking these type of questions all the time, and obviously, like you said, in an ideal world, just do both. But even that, it's not really specific enough. Like, do we devote the same amount of time to each? Do we devote more time to strength? Do we devote more time to cardiovascular stuff? Does that potentially change throughout age? Like, should you be spending the same amount of time on your aerobic fitness when you're 20 years old as when you are 60 years old, So this is an important question to answer, but it's also important to answer from a very fundamental level because it gets into the heart of understanding what we're trying to do when we actually use exercise as a modality to improve our overall health and longevity, right? Like, we actually have to understand what's going on. And the way I'd like you to kind of think about this is there are clearly benefits from just the act of exercise, right? I think we're all in agreement of that. Like, there's social benefits, there are, cardiovascular and metabolic benefits from just getting out and doing any kind of exercise. Like, you can measure this functionally. For example, you might measure your blood glucose before and after exercise, and you can see that is influenced, right? And that might have health repercussions. And I would argue if you're getting out exercising, getting some sort of energy flux, most days, you're probably going to be in better health than someone who does nothing. Would you agree, Gary?
I would definitely agree.
So we can say, okay, there is clearly some benefits to just exercising, right? So that's the first starting point that we have. Again, ideal case scenario, just do both. But really, just do something. Right? So you're going to get some benefits from just doing something. So don't fail to actually start because you're too caught up in going, well, which one's more important? Let me research which one's more important. Do something. There's benefits to just doing something, right? But to really further refine this, we actually have to look at the adaptations we get to exercise, right? And how that intersects with health, right? So the actual results of exercise, right? And this is really important to understand. I'll give you a kind of case study, if you will. If you had an individual who was exercising and they weren't really improving any metrics of performance, whether it's strength, muscle mass, aerobic fitness, anaerobic fitness, whatever, right? They're basically the same level of these fitness qualities as they were previously, right? So they're clearly getting benefits from just exercising, right? But the training that they're doing is not leading to a functional increase in these fitness qualities, right? It's not leading to better fitness. It's not leading to better strength. It's not leading to better muscle, etc. Right? So we have that individual versus the individual who is training away, clearly getting the benefits, the same benefits as the other individual who's training, we'll call them transient benefits. But the way they have their training structured, they're getting fitter. So their resting heart rate is going down, for example, their VO2 max is going up. They're getting stronger. So their overall strength and their muscle mass potentially is also going up, right? So all these different performance metrics, which we'll talk about now in a second, they're increasing, right? So those two individuals, clearly there's going to be a difference in the results they get as it relates to health and longevity, or at least you would presume, right? So they're clearly both getting the benefits of just exercising, these more transient benefits, the cardiometabolic benefits. But one of these individuals is also functionally improving while the other person is just staying the same, right? They're not building anything, right? So if we have those two scenarios here, you can clearly see that, okay, we want to structure our training in such a way that we actually get results, right? But we still want to, in all cases, do some sort of exercise. Like that's the baseline. Do some sort of exercise, regardless of if you get results. That's going to be better than if you do no exercise, right? So we clearly have a gradation here where no exercise is clearly the worst, right? I don't think that's a controversial statement to say, right? Doing some exercise and not really getting much results from it is clearly better, right? But best case scenario for health longevity, we want to actually improve. We want to actually improve the different qualities that we're trying to improve, right? So again, if we relate this back to what we previously discussed in terms of how much exercise should you be doing, this kind of also plays into that discussion, because when we talked about that previously, we talked about this range that you could be in, right? So, we'll say, I have it down here, what is it? The bare minimum of time commitment is 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate physical activity, or 75 to 150 minutes per week of vigorous physical activity, or the equivalent of those combined, right? So somewhere in there seems to be the sweet spot, right? However, what if we could do the bare minimum? So we do the 150 minutes per week of moderate physical activity, but we got way better results, better improvements in fitness, cardiovascular fitness, better improvements in strength, whatever, right? So basically what I'm saying is it's possible potentially to do the bare minimum, but still get better results than someone who is doing the absolute maximum, right? Because if the person doing the maximum here, they're doing the 300 minutes per week, for example, and they're not improving at all. Like they're not really getting fitter. They're not getting stronger. They're clearly spending a lot of time on this stuff. Which would you rather be? Would you rather be the person putting in 150 minutes per week and getting really great results because their program is structured really well, or the individual doing 300 minutes per week and they're kind of just staying the same, right? So it's important to understand that, yes, okay, exercise is important regardless, right? But as humans, we have a constrained amount of time. That's what we're trying to stave off to a degree here. We don't want to, die young from preventable diseases. So how do we spend our time more effectively, right? So that's kind of the kickoff to this discussion. How do we spend that time more effectively, Gary? Like, what should we be focusing on, right? Like, I suppose the way to start this is to run through the different benefits of different types of exercise, like the different qualities we might be changing with the different, if it's more cardiovascular focused, we'll use aerobic fitness as a proxy for that. And then it's more like strength focused. Like, what are the different adaptations and how does that relate to longevity overall? because then we can start answering, okay, well, maybe the strength adaptations are way more important or way more beneficial from a longevity perspective. So let's bias ourselves towards that and just do the bare minimum cardiovascular, or vice versa. So what are your thoughts here, Gary?
Yeah, so firstly, just as an opening point, and this is something we'll discuss a lot more in next week's episode, but for me personally, like my kind of perspective on, the question of can you do too much exercise or where the upper limit is probably in favor of saying that it's not really clear where the upper limit is, and it seems to be consistently benefits from doing more. You look at the available research and you see, an upper limit, of benefits, maybe where the benefits start to decline a little bit, of like 10, 12, 15 hours of exercise per week, which is a lot. That's a lot of training. Similarly, when you look at VO2 max values and levels of cardiorespiratory fitness, they're much higher than what someone would attain if they were just casually, in the gym putting in kind of half-assed effort. So when you look at the general amount of exercise that someone can do and continue to benefit, more is better in most cases. There are exceptions, and there probably is some upper limit, but most people aren't near that. So most people don't need to worry really about being at the point where they're doing too much for their health, outside of course, causing injury or low energy availability, etc. Now, the reason that's important is because what we're talking about here is trying to be efficient with your time. Because while we can look at research that looks at over 750 minutes of exercise per week, still conferring health benefits, most people are nowhere near that. That's athlete territory. Most people are trying.
Like when I was saying earlier on, like, oh, we have this individual who's doing the 300 minutes per week of moderate physical activity, but they're staying the same. Like realistically, that's not a scenario that's likely to happen. Like if you're doing 300 minutes per week of activity, you're probably going to be improving in some regard. Again, it might not be the most efficient way to do it. It's a kind of a blunt force method to just do more work. However, it's very rare that there would be a situation where you just wouldn't get any adaptations by doing more work, But anyway, I just wanted to interject there.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you will generally continue benefiting from doing more work. It obviously becomes more complicated the higher your level of fitness and the specific sports, the qualities, etc. But what we're talking about here is the idea of trying to be efficient, because unfortunately not everyone has enough time to exercise 10 to 15 hours a week. Most people are asking, yeah, most people are asking themselves, how can I use the 3 to 5 hours, let's say, of time that I have available most effectively for my health? Should I be spending my time on the treadmill? Should I be spending my time, lifting weights? Should I be spending my time playing a sport competitively? What exactly should I be aiming at? And here we need to also just add another caveat, and that is that there's a difference between exercise and sports. So if you're competing in a sport, you inherently accept that there's some level of risk of injury, whether it be minor or major. So there's never going to be a zero risk of you getting injured when you're playing a sport. We can bring that risk when we're just training ourselves quite low, because you can just train at a lower level of effort. You can stay further from failure. You can choose safer exercises, etc. But if you're competing in sports, there's always going to be an element of risk there. Now, the risk generally isn't going to be related to the length of your life as such, but it can very much be related to the quality of your life in terms of, if you end up with arthritis, let's say, from repeated injuries, that can compromise quality of life. So that's something that's
important. If you rip your hamstrings right off the bone.
Yeah. Tear all your hamstrings off the bone and require surgery, then yeah, I can confirm that will likely impact your quality of life. So if you play sport, you just have to accept that risk. And that's something I talk to people about all the time, because people often ask me, they say, is there a risk of getting injured in jiu-jitsu or whatever sport they're asking about? And it's like, yes, always. And it could be a very severe injury. Like every time we go to training with jiu-jitsu, you accept that there's some possibility of you getting slammed in your neck and you ending up paralyzed. Like
I'm built different.
You can't be thinking about it all the time, but it is true. And it's true in GAA, it's true in horse riding, it's true in rugby, any sport. Okay.
That's true in walking across the road.
Absolutely.
Like there's just always risk. Like we like to think that, oh, we live in this safe environment, like you live in a city or whatever, we've made it as safe as possible for humans. Absolutely not. Like people literally slip walking down the stairs and become paralyzed. Like,
Absolutely. Yeah. So you can't take risk to zero. That's important. Now, as we focus more on the question of, right, am I going to the treadmill? Am I going to the bike? Or am I going down to the weight section? Of course, the simple answer is both. But in reality, we have different benefits that come from each type of training. And this is important because as we begin to look at aerobic fitness and strength at very low levels, there's going to be general benefits of both. They're going to have metabolic effects. So you're increasing energy expenditure. You'll have better blood glucose regulation. They'll both improve your blood pressure. There's these different general benefits. But as we go towards choosing just one and specializing in that, there's going to be more specialized adaptations in both domains. So for example, when we look at doing more aerobic training, you're generally going to have a lower resting heart rate. So can your resting heart rate reduce during strength training? Absolutely. Is it going to reduce to the same extent? No. Okay, so lower resting heart rate, you're going to have an increased heart rate variability secondary to the vagal tone that's going to occur as you get fitter. Lower blood pressure, potentially. There's some variance here in the research in terms of what the specific effects of strength versus endurance training are on blood pressure. You do see in higher trained or better trained endurance athletes versus strength athletes that they have lower blood pressure. But the problem there is that they also have very different diets, and very different competitive demands, training seasons, etc. So there's a lot more at play. And I think when you look at the research overall, it's hard to say which is better for blood pressure regulation. But generally, over time, you do observe that endurance athletes tend to have lower blood pressure. There's mitochondrial adaptations that are going to happen to a greater extent, where you're going to increase the number and size of your mitochondria in an endurance trained athlete. Blood lipid variations are going to be very subtle. Probably not too much of an impact there between strength and endurance, maybe slightly higher HDL in an endurance athlete, but I wouldn't focus on that too much. Just not an important thing, really. And then when it comes to your mood, mental health, cognition, brain health, some evidence would suggest that, higher levels of aerobic fitness are, really important there, especially in terms of insulin sensitivity, blood glucose regulation, and the impact long-term on brain health. There probably are, relatively, there are benefits to both strength and endurance training or aerobic training here, that, I probably wouldn't divorce them too much. But overall, there are, clearly some specialized benefits. The main things there that stand out from aerobic fitness would probably be the mitochondrial components, the resting heart rate variability. They're kind of the main things. And then more specifically, then the cardiovascular adaptations, like if you get down to the level of the blood vessel, the things that happen in the heart, etc., beyond the scope of today, but there are far more things that do occur. But then as we look at the strength side of things, in terms of someone who's doing resistance training, of course, higher levels of muscle strength, higher levels of muscle mass, greater bone density, all of which are very important. So on one side, we've got benefits that are probably more cardiorespiratory and metabolic specific. And then on the other side, we've got more of the strength, muscle, and bone, as well as the metabolic. So there's some divergence in terms of the adaptations, but remember that they do start generally. Now, as we take that into account, what you have to think about then is what contributes to mortality. And this question actually might be a little bit different depending on, your family history, for example. So if you've got a very strong family history of, let's say, frailty, sarcopenia, and low or osteoporosis, that might be a slightly different decision matrix versus the person who has a very significant cardiovascular history, a history of heart failure, heart attacks, etc. They're slightly different cases. So overall, like cardiovascular disease is probably the thing that is most important to try to stave off. And then if you do get into your later life, you want to stave off frailty and sarcopenia for sure. And those things are somewhat interlinked. So for me, at least, it's very hard to say you should pick either. I think that you can get a lot of the or some of the benefits of improved function and staving off sarcopenia with your aerobic training. And then similarly, you can get some of the benefits to your cardiovascular and metabolic health from your strength training. So I would again come back to saying both and find it very hard to say that you should just do one. I think in terms of time, I think aerobic training probably should take up more of your training time because the time that you need to get a decent level of strength that's going to preserve your health is actually not that much. If you're training 2-3 days a week in the gym for 30 to 45 minutes, you're probably, getting close to the maximum amount of benefits you might get from just strength over time, because it's not like you need to have 140 bench and 200 kilo squat to max out the benefits. And I think that right now we probably have a lot better evidence on the aerobic training higher side of the spectrum in terms of multiple hours, up to 10 hours plus, still potentially conferring benefits. So if I was to look at it purely in a time sense, more time spent doing aerobic training or cardio is probably better for long-term health. But if you're someone who's done that all your life, it might actually be better to spend more time doing strength training now. So as always, it depends. Bit of a cop-out answer, but that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think we should just go through some of the more strength-specific adaptations because it actually does help people answer this question for themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because while the cardiovascular stuff that we just talked about there, it's kind of a little bit easier to see. It's kind of a little bit easier to kind of go, oh yeah, look, I know cardio is good for the heart. I know it's good for, metabolic stuff. I know it's good for, these different things. Cool, right? But why would we even do strength? You were just saying there, or do strength training, I should say. Like you were just saying there that we have a lot more evidence for the aerobic benefits, in terms of longevity. We're like, oh, well, we can actually do a lot of aerobic training and continue to see positive results. So let's just do more aerobic training.
Can
Right?
I just clarify there for 1 second? So just for the listener, in case it's confusing, when I say we have more evidence, I mean that we just have like a clearer understanding because there's more research, whereas we don't have as much research on people who are doing extreme volumes of resistance training, for example, whereas endurance athletes and people who are doing very high levels of aerobic training recreationally, there's a lot of evidence on that. It's just that it's less well characterized. So it's not that there's evidence comparing these two and saying, oh, resistance training is poorer, but rather that we just don't really know what the upper limit looks like for health.
Yeah, and that's important to understand because again, like if you look at the trend in, we'll call it sports science, like a lot of it just started the earlier work in like say the 60s to 70s, even into the 80s. Like it was pretty much all aerobic focused. Like it was all just cardiovascular training focused because obviously a lot of the researchers that went into the field, like they were coming from, a running background or these different things, right? Whereas like resistance training, strength training has only really been massively popularized, we'll say, since the 80s. 90s became way more, but it's really only the late 2000s, actually the late 2000s, like 2005 to the current day, where it's really taken off that most people would be doing some form of resistance training. Like I remember when I grew up, like there was one gym in my area, and Gary, you've been to Sandyford now, and there's like fucking 20 gyms, so like it is only really taken off in the last few years. So how would you expect us to have long-term data for that stuff, right? Of course we wouldn't. So we have more data on the aerobic stuff as it relates to longevity, at least, whereas we don't have as much for the resistance training focused stuff longer term. And we can also make mechanistic hypotheses as to why aerobic training might be more beneficial, especially considering that there doesn't seem to be a upper limit to the adaptations you can get. Like you can continue to improve them, whereas at a certain point, it's going to be very hard to improve your strength. It's going to be very hard to improve your muscle mass, but you could still be getting aerobic adaptations. you know. But anyway, that's a further aside. But anyway, strength specific stuff, right? Like some of the things that are related to strength that might increase your longevity or potentially increase the health of your years. You know, we're going to see potentially an increase in muscle mass, which obviously has an anti-sarcopenic, so an anti-muscle loss element to it as you age. Stronger muscles and better coordinated, better functioning muscles obviously make life a little bit easier. Like if your 1 rep max of a split squat or something is like below your body weight, at a certain stage, like walking up the stairs, it's gonna be it's gonna be challenging, like because you just don't have the strength. So how could you be expected to live your life? You know, you're basically always at like your limit strength. So getting stronger obviously improves your function, which is really vital as you age, because you don't want to be doing like, you know, falling and different things like that, right? Or you want to be able to catch yourself when you fall. So you need to have those well-coordinated muscles and stronger bones. That's a common one that's discussed, especially as it relates to women. So we want to stave off that osteoporosis. So again, resistance training is a phenomenal tool for that. And we see increased joint stability and integrity with resistance training. And that's generally because we get into these different ranges of motion, we'll put it like that, where you might not when you're doing just cardiovascular training. Like imagine you did cardiovascular training and you were just always on a, you know, let's say a lower impact version of cardiovascular machinery. Like you did something like a, what are they called? Like an elliptical, that's the word. Like you're always doing something like that. Like you're never really getting into like a deep squat position, for example. So like, why would your body prioritize, you know, the stability in that position, right? So again, going through these different ranges of motion with resistance training, potential benefits there for joint stability. Obviously the muscles get stronger as well, and that overall integrity of the different joints, right? Similar to cardiovascular training, we see better insulin sensitivity and metabolic health, which obviously has effects in an anti-diabetic, you know, way. You do see lower blood pressure. Again, there might be different mechanisms as it relates to aerobic or cardiovascular training. But again, either way, you're still getting the functional outcome that you want, right? You see generally lowered resting heart rates. Again, is it as low as, you know, cardiovascular training? Yeah, probably not, you know. And again, we do see those cognitive and mood enhancing effects from exercise in general, right? We might also see better neuromuscular control and coordination of our muscles because we're going through these different ranges of motion and we're doing it usually under higher loads. However, you do somewhat get those benefits from just doing cardiovascular training in general. Like you have to be able to coordinate your movement, but generally because you're doing a larger pool or a larger variety of movements with strength training in general, like you're probably going to see a better overall neuromuscular coordination. You know, maybe you disagree with that, Gary, but in my experience and my understanding of the research, I think that's fairly safe to say, you know. So there's some of the strength specific adaptations, but one of the things we haven't touched on, which kind of blurs the line between the two of them, because it is cardiovascular in nature, but some of the adaptations also come from strength training, and that is more anaerobic style training. So like resistance training is somewhat anaerobic. Like it's probably more of that creatine phosphate system a lot of times, especially the way most people lift. Like they're doing a 12 rep set and it lasts like 3 seconds. But we are doing more anaerobic style training in general when we're doing resistance training. But what if we were to do like, you know, sprint training, you know, actual cardiovascular quote unquote training, but in a more anaerobic style? Like a lot of these benefits, at least from my understanding, do come from the aerobic adaptations, you know? So it's basically the recovery period from that. And this is also why you often see like the aerobic adaptations seem to drop off 6 to 8 weeks of anaerobic training. Like you're not really getting a huge benefit thereafter in terms of aerobic fitness. And that's usually when people just kind of go, oh, like, I'm just going to not do this training anymore because they're not seeing a huge amount of benefit. And again, it goes back to that case study that I was saying at the start. Like you could be doing a huge amount of anaerobic training, but not really seeing any performance increases. You know, you might get some localized effects, like you might be able to buffer acidosis a little bit better from like upregulation of certain enzymes and whatever else, but that's not really all that effective in promoting longevity. You know, like I'd rather see you get a lower resting heart rate or get a higher VO2 max, because we know that at least those things seem to be correlated with better longevity, you know. With specific anaerobic training, like you can also just kind of get a lot of those benefits from just doing resistance training. So you don't necessarily need to do anaerobic specific training. That's important to understand, because if we're talking about, okay, how are we going to spend our hours? How are we going to spend our hours on our training budget? I probably, even though people are like, oh, it's so effective, it's so like time efficient. Like, yeah, it's time efficient in a short-term sense. Like you can burn 50 calories very quickly doing anaerobic training, but you're kind of cutting yourself, like it's not time efficient over the long course as it relates to, you know, health and longevity, because you're not actually getting the adaptations that you want, you know. Like if you just do a load of anaerobic training, like, yeah, you get fitter for the first couple of weeks, months even, but at a certain point, you're not getting fitter. Whereas if you were to do more anaerobic training, again, the ceiling for that is, it just keeps going. You're never touching it, you know? So I probably wouldn't be spending a huge amount of my training budget on anaerobic training outside of resistance training, right? There is a case to be made that anaerobic training seems to be better for improving VO2 max, at least certain types of anaerobic training, even though people call it aerobic training in the research, which is not the case, because they're like, they're like, oh yeah, like you're going to be working at a 90% of your VO2 max for 3 minutes. And they're like, oh, this is aerobic training. And I'm like it is absolutely not aerobic training. But we might be eliciting some aerobic benefits from that. But again, this is one of those things where the effects seem to drop off relatively quickly. Like it might be better for improving things over a shorter time course, but who cares? Who cares over like 6 weeks? Like we're not trying to just improve our VO2 max over 6 weeks and then we're done for the rest of our lives. Like that doesn't make sense, right? We want to improve our VO2 max over the next 50 years of our life. 100 years in my case. Gary, maybe you get 50 years. You know, like we want to keep going. So aerobic training seems to be a better option overall, right? And then just to finally round out the discussion here in terms of, okay, how are we allocating our time? Like sports, these may be a consideration for some people. They might want to train a certain sport. There are potentially additional benefits to sporting activities in terms of like hand-eye coordination, social aspects, but the main drawback with sports is obviously specific adaptations to impose demands. And what I mean by that is you might not be able to get the aerobic benefits or the strength benefits because your sport doesn't focus on that, you know? Like you might play, I don't know, I can't think of a sport that just has no strength benefit or whatever, you know, but there's certain sports where you're just like, okay, maybe they're more like if you're just doing endurance running, you know, you're just like, oh, I just run. Like you're probably not getting the strength benefits that we want, you know? So that's one of the things. Another thing with sports is like, are you going to be able to continue this after 35 years old? Like that's a major consideration, you know? Like if your sport is like, all right, everyone is just retired at 35, which is the case for a lot of sports, you know, what do you do after that? Do you have a training paradigm for when you retire? A lot of people don't, you know? So putting that all together, we have certain aerobic benefits, we have certain strength specific benefits, we have certain anaerobic specific benefits, and then we have certain sport specific benefits, right? If it was me, I'm probably going to spend the majority of my time on the aerobic stuff and the strength stuff, right? Like, yeah, okay, sports, they play a role in that. Like you could be doing sporting training, like I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I kind of just treat that as aerobic training, right? There's maybe a little bit of an anaerobic component, like when you're doing, you know, rounds, you know, there's obviously an anaerobic component there, but the vast majority of the stuff, I'm really in that kind of heart rate zone of like 120 to 150, you know, so it's aerobic training. So I don't know, Gary, how do we put that all together, and how do we then think about like what should we actually be doing as people?
Yeah, so I think, as I said at the beginning, anytime you do a sport, you obviously accept health risks, that, sports shouldn't be considered the same thing as health behaviors, although it, includes them. It includes training, it includes generally eating well, but it also includes the risk that comes along with competing in sport. So what I would say on that as well is that if you're competing in a sport that has a short shelf life, where you're not going to be playing beyond your 30s, it is useful that during that time, especially if you're not a very serious athlete, that you do some other activities that you can enjoy and take beyond that period of time when you stop the sport. Because if you do compete in a sport where, you've never had any opportunity to train on your own, like let's say it's a team sport and the only reason you show up to training is because there's the accountability, you're forced to show up, then maybe those behaviors won't actually carry over after and when you have to train on your own. So that's something that's worth thinking about if you're in that position.
There's
Now,
also some like negatives as well. Like we do it all, we train, like I know whenever I do like a sales call or something, like a lot of people come to us, especially for nutrition focused stuff, especially they try to go to Brian or Dean for this stuff. But they'll come to us after having played rugby, for example, or soccer or whatever for a long time. And then they're finished and they still eat like they did when they were training 4, 5, 6 hours per week of a like highly competitive, highly intense, sport. So they've built up all these habits of like feelings of hunger, satiety related to that. And now they retired and they don't have anything to fill that like activity void. And all of a sudden they're eating in a 2000 calorie surplus every single day, but they can't get out of that habit. They can't, like, they need a big meal to feel full because that's the habit they've built from their sporting activity. So that is another component as well. It's not all just fucking, sunshine and roses from a sporting environment. Whereas I feel like with training yourself, like resistance training or even cardiovascular training yourself, that stuff is a little bit more well managed.
absolutely. So in terms of what you should do then, as we said, do both. And I think it's a reasonable starting point to actually just start with the exercise guidelines, where they suggest, a minimum of 2 days of strength training per week, where you're training all major muscle groups, and then 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic training per week. Like that's a reasonable starting point for people. Like if you want to max out your strength, and I think while you're young, there's no harm in doing that, like getting close to maybe your max potential in terms of strength. Like even if you got 80, 90% of the way there, you're doing fantastic. Probably be there within 3 to 5 years, and then spend the next 2 decades trying to eke out another 5%. So if you put 3 to 5 years of good quality resistance training in, you've probably got most of the strength and muscle mass benefits that you're going to get from a health perspective. And then maybe you focus more on the aerobic training. Now, the other thing is that most people aren't setting up their training with only longevity in mind. So what you should be thinking here is, how can I train in a way that I enjoy, that encompasses these considerations for health? So if you can find an activity, a form of aerobic training, let's say, that you're able to do for 3, 4, 5+ hours per week, then you're in a great place. And that's why, you mentioned jiu-jitsu a minute ago. Like that can be treated as a form of aerobic training, and it's very enjoyable. And it's something that you do without thinking about it as being cardio as such. Because trying to do 5 hours on a stationary bike on your own in the gym that's very difficult to do. And it's probably not something you're going to sustain.
That would definitely disimprove my mental health.
Yeah, that's probably not something that you're going to sustain. So maybe it's that you do some sort of activity, maybe you do an exercise class, or maybe you do hiking at the weekends. Whatever you can do to try to get up to at least multiple hours of aerobic training per week would be wise. And then from a strength training perspective, maybe you're already really into that. You're really into lifting weights already. If you're not, then maybe you just go with the lower end of 2 days per week, all major muscle groups. You go with a friend or something along those lines, and that's how you tick that box. If you're someone that's already, pretty strong and pretty well muscled, and you're just doing aerobic training at the moment and you're maintaining your gains, you're probably fine. You probably don't need to be lifting weights all the time. But I think for most people, they should at least be doing some sort of maintenance training, because you do decline with age. Depending on what age you are now, you are facing a decline in your strength, in your muscle mass, in your bone mass, and in your aerobic fitness over time. And that's what we see in terms of the research on aerobic training. The maximum benefits of in terms of your level of fitness they're higher at younger ages because there's a natural decline. So the more you have to begin with, the more you have to lose, and therefore the longer you can maintain the maximum benefits. So get a little bit stronger and get a little bit fitter than you think you might need to be, and then you can lose it over time.
100%. And to kind of put this in perspective, I always like to think, like, if you had best case scenario, like let's say you were just training a child, like you literally had your child, right? Whatever, right? Like what way would you actually structure this throughout their lifetime, or at least, you know, help them structure this stuff throughout their lifetime? Like realistically, if you're a child, like let's say in the 0 to 15 years, right, you don't actually have a huge muscle building capacity, right? Like obviously a child is building muscle, right? But it really is only when puberty hits that, you know, we have more anabolic hormones, let's say, that allow us to build more muscle, right? And now again, children can be well muscled, but they're just not going to be as well muscled as like a 16-year-old. Like it's just it's just the way it is, right? And so if that's the case, we probably want to just build this huge aerobic gas tank, right? Where we're just like, right, let's actually get incredibly fit as a child, but also work on improving like neuromuscular control. So doing a variety of sports, doing a variety of movements, just getting better at moving your body through space. So this like kind of proprioceptive control, right? And then as you get into your teen years, and maybe up until, let's say 35, like that's a bit of an arbitrary cutoff here, but we'll just say 35, like you're probably going to want to maximize your muscle mass and your muscle strength, right? And the sooner you can do that, probably the better. Like if you could do that by 20, and you're like a very quick and easy way to work out your like natty potential or your natural potential without using drugs is like whatever your weight or whatever your height is in centimeters, take 100 away from that, and that's a rough goal for your, you know, weight in kilograms at a relatively lean position. So I'm 195 centimeters, so for me somewhere around 95 kilos, if I was like, you know, relatively lean at that, that's probably a good place to be. Like I'm never going to be 105 kilos shredded unless there's a little bit of like special sauce that goes into it, right? So that's something to just keep in mind. There's probably a limit to how much muscle you can gain. There's probably a higher limit to how much strength you can gain, in terms of like everyone has different limb lengths and everything else. So like if we just all compare it by the bench press, it's probably not a great tool. But if we all compare it to something like I don't know, like a floor press, you know, there's probably more evenness in that, you know? So like, it just depends on what exact strength metric we're using for that. But either way, improve your strength, improve your muscle in those kind of 15 to 35 years of age, right? After that, like ideally, you'd have built all the muscle that you're going to build or going to be able to build. So we can move more into what we generally tend to refer to as gaintenance, you know? And again, the Americans, it's disgusting, but they call it main gaining, which is
Oh my God.
I know. But anyway, gaintenance. So we'll move more into that kind of phase of our life where we're like, yeah, look, if we get some gains, happy days. Otherwise, we're just focusing on maintaining what we've already built, right? We might then switch our training a little bit to start devoting more time towards aerobic training. Now, I'm assuming in this kind of 15 to 35 years of age, you've still kept up some sort of aerobic training. Like if we spent the first 15 years of our life really building a massive aerobic gas tank, like you don't want to just lose that, right? So you still want to do some aerobic training, but maybe it's less, you know, less of a focus of your training in those 15 to 35 years. So you like have 20 years of less aerobic training. And then as you get older, we're probably going to devote more and more time towards that aerobic training, because again, the benefits don't seem to drop off. Like there's this, I mean, the ceiling is so much higher. It's going to be a way longer slog to get up to it. And you continually see benefits along the way, the higher your aerobic fitness, right? And during that time, so 35 plus, we're still working on maintaining the strength that we have. So let's say, for example, you have 5 hours of training. Maybe when you're in your 15 to 35 years of age, you're doing 4 resistance training. So 4 of those hours are dedicated towards resistance training. And then you're just doing an hour or so of aerobic training. And then when we hit like 35 and above, maybe we're doing 2 to 3 of those hours are resistance training, and then 2 to whatever hours, 2 to 3, I should say, of those hours are aerobic training, depending on exactly how we want to split it up, you know? That's probably what I would encourage people to do. Now, obviously, if you have more hours to spend, you have more hours to spend. As you get 65 plus, like, we might actually want to pick up a little bit more resistance training, right? And the reason for that is, you know, this is probably the time where you start losing a bit of muscle, right? You start losing a bit of strength. So we might actually have to do a little bit more to kind of overcome that anabolic resistance, right? So that maybe how you could structure it if you had this like ideal picture of your overall life and going like, oh, when am I going to structure all these different things? And obviously, look, if you're listening to this and you're 40 and you're going, man, I've never trained. You know, I remember I trained when I was a child, but in the last 30 years, I haven't done anything. Like, it's not saying that you have to start from the start. Like, in that case, again, doing anything is probably the best place to start, right? And then you can start splitting up your training based on, we'll call it a functional needs analysis. Like, are you just really unfit? Do you have very low levels of muscle mass? Like, well, where are we at? What is the biggest return on investment for you based on your, you know, needs right now? So do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
No, I don't think so. I think it sounds like a good old plan of action, you know. So if you've got your little baby that you're trying to mold at home, that's what you're gonna do.
Fantastic. But yeah, so in kind of summary to all of this, because it has been a little bit disjointed, but it'll make more sense when you listen to the rest of the episodes in this series, especially the next one as well. That hopefully gives you a little bit of an overview of going, okay, well, I actually need to sit down and do a little bit of a functional needs analysis and see where I'm weakest. And how does that line up with my next 5, 10, 15, 20, 40, 50-year goals, right? But the main thing I want you to really take away from this is that a variety of the top predictors of longevity are actually performance related, right? And importantly, they're also modifiable, right? And some of them, such as, you know, I have a few down here, like lower body strength, hand grip strength, muscle mass, sit to stand ability, VO2 max, resting heart rate, HRV, walking speed. There's a whole variety of them, right? They're modifiable, right? And we know that they're associated with longevity, right? So if you want to live longer, let's focus on the stuff that's modifiable. Like, people always get caught up in going, oh, I have this genetic risk factor, or I have XYZ, all these different things that are just not modifiable, right? You're like, okay, I might have to take drugs for this, and as a result, it's modifiable. But there's certain things where you could just do an activity. Like, you could just improve your VO2 max, for example, and you would see potentially improvements in longevity, right? So that's important to understand. There are performance-related longevity markers, and they're modifiable, right? And this always brings me back when you ever, like, I'm sure you've seen this before, Gary, in like jujitsu and stuff. People will say like, oh, you're using too much strength, or oh, like, yeah, that was good, but like, oh, you're very strong. And like, strength is literally a modifiable attribute,
Yeah.
you know? Like, if you're tapping out to someone that is stronger than you are tapping out to someone that has a benefit over you in something that is modifiable. Like, people are less likely to say that and go, oh, you're very fit, or oh, you're very flexible, which are also modifiable things, you know, but they focus on the strength thing because they're weak, you know? So again, it is a modifiable thing that we can actually work on. And as a result of that, if you want to live longer, let's do these things, right? But then on top of that, there are a number of other markers such as blood lipids, metabolic health related markers that are also positively influenced by exercise, right? And a lot of them are just influenced by the actual act of exercising itself. So you don't even need to improve the different performance related metrics to see a benefit here. Obviously, there are certain protocols that are going to be better for whatever the exact goal is. And then obviously there's a huge social contribution, especially if you are doing stuff in like a gym. Like, that's I've said it before, like, I moved over to London, and like, the friends that I have over here, you know, I met in the gym or I met in jiu-jitsu. So there's a huge like social part of all of this, you know. And I know loads of people who've done something similar where they've moved over to a different country and like they want to make friends, so they join a gym or they join a sport. So that kind of stuff, it might seem meaningless, but when you really look at the bigger picture of like all the socioeconomic psychosocial, I suppose you'd say, attributes or properties of overall health, yeah, we still want to focus on that stuff, right? And it's very often glossed over in more of the mechanistic, physiological stuff. But it is important to understand that being happy is probably a thing that you want for a long life, right? So it makes sense to exercise. Ultimately, like Gary said previously, find the exercise that you enjoy and call it a day. That's it. If you can, do some resistance training, do some aerobic training, you're good to go. It's very hand wavy. It's very like, okay, do a little bit of everything and happy days. But unless I have an individual in front of me and I can do a proper needs analysis and go, well, look, your resting heart rate is in the 70s, your VO2 max is terrible. And while, yeah, you have a lot of muscle mass and a lot of strength, this is the thing that needs to be worked on, right? I can't do that across a podcast format. That's only something you can do on an individual basis. So that is something that if you're listening to this, you kind of have to be honest with yourself. Like, do you have good performance metrics? And maybe we'll do that in one of these things where we'll just go through the different targets for all of these performance metrics, and then maybe how you train for each of them. That's a pretty long episode it would be, but maybe that's something we'll do. But either way, Gary, training is good. Doing a variety of training modalities are good. If we just did the recommendations, we'd probably be in a good place, But do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think just all I would say is that generally we can all benefit from doing more exercise, or at least most of us can benefit from doing more exercise. And when you look at the effects that exercise has on health and longevity, both quality and quantity of life, the effects are far, far more significant than the vast majority of the things that people worry about. People worry about supplements, these, does this increase longevity or this component of food? Like, I generally find that people are way more neurotic about very minor nutrition details, despite the fact that they don't exercise that much. They do a little bit of training, guys that go to the gym and then they're worrying about the specific components of, I don't know, an energy drink or something, and they don't do any cardio. Like these things, improving your aerobic fitness, improving your strength, etc., are far, far, far more meaningful for longevity. This also is something we'll discuss in future episodes, but when you look at like conventional cardiovascular risk factors that people are constantly trying to modify, aerobic fitness has such a large effect, and far more than some of these risk factors that people worry about. So my message, as always, is, train plenty, train often, and you'll have a good life, in that, being fit is not just about longevity. It's not just about quality of life. It's also about your capability. You have the ability to traverse the world as a human, and depending on what you do, you might be able to fend for yourself a little bit better, whether not just in a combat sense, but in that if you ever end up in a situation where you need to move something out of the way or you need to escape, like, you have all these abilities because of your fitness. So yeah, train plenty, train often.
And especially in combat as well, because as we've discussed previously, interpersonal violence is one of the major killers of people our age. So ideally you would be able to defend yourself. Anyway, that's it for this episode. Gary, where can people find us?
And as always, guys,
what services do we sell, Gary?
Well, we now have a nutrition certification that, of course, you guys are aware of by now if you're following. So if you'd like to get certified as a nutritionist with Triage, whether that be an independent certification or something you'd like to add to your personal training practice, you can do so. That's open now. There's no prerequisites. You don't have to be a personal trainer. You don't have to have any prior nutrition education. But it is designed in such a way that it will take you from a fairly low level of understanding to a fairly high level of understanding, or if you already have a decent level of understanding, you're still going to benefit quite a bit, because there's varying levels of depth, and you'll have to pass exams and everything to get your cert. They're, relatively challenging but manageable, because we want it to be, something that people can do without having prior education, while still benefiting those that do, as we said. So if you'd like to get involved, do get involved. That should be linked in the description box below. So click the link and get involved. And if you have any questions, you can of course ask. If you'd rather just engage with our coaching service, you want to work on your own goals, it's not about your personal coaching development, then we do have coaching spaces available as well. So check the description box for more information on that. We have a weekly newsletter that you can subscribe to below. We also have a lot of free content that we put out on social media. So you can follow us at Triage Method on Instagram and various other platforms as well. And then finally, if you enjoy the podcast, we always appreciate when people, share it on their story or they leave a rating and review. And of course, make sure you're subscribed. Maybe you're listening regularly, but you realize you're not subscribed on your podcast app. So do that too.
Splendid. Anyway, I don't have anything else to say. So I hope everyone enjoyed this, and I look forward to speaking to you in the future.